you some other questions if we get through these ones that will help us understand you and your
Sure.
history a bit better. I know Derek. I know Derek personally. Derek was introduced to me by John Lepke, another member of Listen to Disc community, as a potential trainer for my service dog in training, whose name is Lita. So Derek and I don't go way back, but I feel like I know Derek fairly well because of the intimate nature of training us, the humans, that are actually helping sometimes train the dogs that are going to be service dogs. Derek, let's just start out with the conversation around the difference between the emotional support, therapy dogs, and service dogs.
Yeah, absolutely. So sometimes there's some confusion between what all three designations are and what they mean. So I'll just start with the first one that you had mentioned, which is an emotional support animal. So in Saskatchewan, there's really not much of a designation as far as what an emotional support animal is. It's not covered under the policy on service animals in Saskatchewan. So more or less in our province, it doesn't really mean much of anything, but often in other areas, it's more or less a dog that provides support for a person, but has not received any formal training whatsoever as far as service specific tasking for the person suffering with the disability that the dog would mitigate. So more or less just its physical presence being there so a person can pet or be near it. It offers that level of emotional support. Is that clear? All right. So I'll move on to a therapy dog. Okay. I'm not going to talk much about emotional support because there's not really much to talk about in our province, but therapy dogs are a lot more prevalent and helpful in numerous ways. And what a therapy dog really is you can think of that dog is for other people. So more or less, it's like, for instance, I used to do therapy dog work with one of my dogs named Ozzy. He's passed because it's been some time has elapsed and natural causes all happen. But we used to go to various long-term care facilities, schools, and so forth to do some educating, but also just engage and interact with, people who are in those facilities. And what our job was I was just there as the handler to bring a safe dog into an organization or facility for everyone to enjoy, engage with, and potentially learn from and feel more comfortable around. So I'll go on a side tangent here for a sec because there was this really neat story that I wanted to share about a circumstance with me at St. Mike's School in Moose Jaw in the one of the wards with children with variable abilities. Anyhow, we were going to this facility for about a year, okay? And there was this one boy who was really scared of my dog Ozzy. He's a big German Shepherd cross, and he's not intimidating in his actions, but his physical posture is a little bit. And this one boy, every time we would come in, he would scream at the top of his lungs and he would kind of run like a step away backwards. Now, over that year, he got a bit more confident as time went, and he'd kind of like lead in to go and touch him and then run away and scream. But there was this really critical moment where things transitioned, and one of the support workers, and I don't remember what her designation was, but she had a fair bit of understanding of some things. And she had came in and seen what was going on. And she's like, you know what? Like, why don't we go for a walk in the hallway of the school? And this boy can walk with you, but behind you. Okay. She's like, I think what's happening is the boy is getting really frightened when the dog makes eye contact with him. And I was like, oh, that totally makes sense because that's what it is with dog to dog stuff. And I was like, why didn't I think of that? But anyways, needless to say, we're walking and the boy is behind me by 5 or 10 steps, and my dog Ozzy's in front of me. I'm just letting him kind of walk through the halls and all the kids say hi. And this boy walks closer and closer, and he's kind of looking around to a point where he actually grabbed the leash and walked my dog through the hallways and ended up touching and petting his bum and petting his head. It was like one of the most remarkable moments in my time doing therapy dog work. Is incredibly powerful and emotional, and it still imprints on me. And there was many other circumstances that were very heartwarming, but that one really sticks out because of just a little tweak, and that boy went from being like terrified to like, oh, I like this guy. And it was really heartwarming and sweet. So I just wanted to share the value and the beauty that therapy dogs bring, and sometimes relief and support. So I don't know if you want to comment on any of these things at any time, Tracy. You feel free to. I can always, of course, just continue rattling off.
I'll stay out of your way for now.
Okay. Sounds good. So, anyways, basically, just to reiterate, a therapy dog is really just a dog that has been trained to assist other people and support them, more or less just by being a well mannered dog that is safe in general around people and other dogs, and has the capacity to go into varied environments and be confident and fine. And some examples of therapy dogs are like I don't know what their actual name is, but they have them at some airports where you're stressed out, flights are delayed, and there's a dog walking around. I remember being in San Diego airport, and they're cruising around, and I was like, oh, I want to pet them. Anyway, there's one example. Some are going to long-term care facilities of that nature. Another example is like we have a facility dog in training, which is more or less a therapy dog for a staff of Moose Jaw EMS and paramedic services. So it's basically a therapy dog for the staff, but it's called a facility dog. And that's another example. So the spectrum is broad of how they can help, and really unique and fun, just simple way of, hey, bring this dog in, and totally changes the situation of how people feel often. So next, just to provide an explanation about what the difference is between a therapy dog and a service dog. So a service dog is paired with a person with a disability. It can vary between mobility, psychiatric, etc. It's all across the board, but they have a defined disability that the dog helps and has been specially trained to mitigate and assist. Okay. So this, you think about, the service dog is for the handler, not anyone else. So that's a pretty kind of easier distinction, but it does require specialized training. So for instance, some examples are like a post-traumatic stress assistance dog, autism assistance dog. They call it a little bit something different in Saskatchewan. It's like a SSIG, but anyhow, mobility assistance dogs, they're really, you could go across the board too, to like there's police service dogs and so forth, and etc. So that's more or less the differences between the three big, emotional support animal, therapy dog, and service dogs. Is the therapy dog's for someone else, the service dog is for the person with the disability.
Great. Already I'm learning. So I just have a casual curiosity. The emotional support dog, is that in Saskatchewan? Would that simply be experienced as a pet?
More or less, yes. Like,
Okay.
there's not any definition anywhere that I have ever found that would define that, but pretty much an emotional support dog is just someone who has a companion animal that really helps them feel
Yeah.
better.
Okay. And then the therapy dogs, just to echo what you said, therapy dogs, the easiest way to think about are for others, and the service dogs for an individual, some self or a specific individual.
Yeah, you
Yeah,
bet.
very cool. And thank you for that story. The one thing that at Listen to This we're learning quite quickly with having Lita around is how, first of all, how supportive it is to have a dog in the presence of all of us. So where we're working specifically in drama.
Mhm.
And then secondly, there are two specific members that were quite frightened of dogs when Lita first started to show up. And it's been interfered with by COVID, but up until that point, it has been really beautiful and profound to watch the navigating of getting closer and building trust with this dog, because Lita too she's a sweetheart, but she can be intimidating relative to her size and the size of her head and the intensity in which she'll watch you. So yeah, I love the story, and thank you for that. Um, I guess we can move to, just a little conversation or a little information from you about the Saskatchewan policy on service.
Yeah, for sure. So I don't want to um, reiterate it entirely or anything, but I thought I could provide you all with an idea of where to find it, so you can, review it at your leisure and interpret it as well. But it's on the SaskatchewanHumanRights.ca website. I can even put a link into the comments here, maybe. Um, I could see if I could figure that out, but here, no, that's the wrong button. Maybe not right now. But anyways, the easiest thing to do is, instead of stumbling through my technical deficiencies, is to just go to the Saskatchewan Human Rights website and search in SK policy on service animals. And in any event, it just outlines what constitutes a service animal, um, and what kind of rights go along with the handler of the animal. And there was something that stuck out to me from a conversation with one of the for lack of a better term, employees of Saskatchewan Human Rights, was that the public access rights that are mentioned within this policy are really for the person. So the dog doesn't necessarily have the rights. It's the person who has the access rights and the ability to bring, an entity such as a dog to mitigate their disability. So that's kind of an interesting distinction, because sometimes there gets to be conversations about, does the dog have rights to be in certain public situations? And anyways, that is something that I found interesting. If you ever have any questions, I would refer to the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission to ask them directly for their feedback, because the reality is there is some openness to the policy. So they have to review certain situations more on a case by case basis, because there's a lot of kind of little pieces and nooks and crannies that every person or situation won't necessarily fit into this like 2-page PDF policy. So if you ever have any issues, questions, concerns, and want a little bit more feedback and understanding, just go ahead and contact the Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission, and they can, help you understand things better, or send you in the direction that you need. That's pretty much all I have to say about that. We can move on to the next topic if you're interested.
For sure, for sure. And actually, we can send out a link for you, Derek, to the folks that are here with us today. The human rights link, just get it from you. The one thing I want to do before we move on is just to ask you, when I met you and I came in, I felt like the process was going to be fairly straightforward. But then we had a very lengthy conversation, and you had a very lengthy document for me to fill out. And I believe I've visited that document twice in my case, because we were a little COVID interrupted. And I was wondering if you just take a moment to help clarify some of the differences. You spoke quickly about them, but I remember looking at psychiatric service. I remember looking at all the questions for the multitude of options that we can have, that there are, in order to find support. I wonder if you'd feel comfortable just speaking a little bit more to that.
As far as like specific tasks, sometimes service
Yeah, like
dogs
the
provide.
multitude of tasks that are available to folks to train their dogs for, or to have dogs
Sure.
trained in. And also, the difference for somebody like myself with CPTSD and various other things that affect mobility, it wasn't a straightforward, here's how your dog's going to be trained, and this is what's going to happen as a result of that. It was more complex than that. The process was about myself, much more personally, and actually about us in the conversation. You helped me to cultivate an understanding in certain ways of what might be of service to me relative to some of the things that go on a day-to-day basis for me. Yeah.
For sure. So the reality is just it's not a cookie cutter program for anyone to just fall into, like you're going to get a mobility service dog, because sometimes it's just there's various things going on. And with our situation, I just wanted to make sure in a broad fashion and kind of getting a 3,000-foot view, I was able to understand your needs and wants from a service animal. So certain tasks that dogs help with people vary drastically, but I'll go through a handful of them. So for example, like some dogs will remind people to take their medication at certain times of day. So for instance, 6 a.m., the dog alerts a bell and hits the bell until the person gets up, and then the person goes and takes their medication and the dog backs off. Another example can be retrieving items, right? One of my clients has trouble with dexterity at times, and her dog can pick up credit cards off the ground. Like they're this thin, but the dog like figures it out and picks it up and then brings it to her. Some dogs like just help put on socks, like, or take them off, like where if someone has limited mobility to kind of reach down to their feet, they'll kind of pull off a little bit and then they kind of have to take a step back and the dog will grab the rest of it and drag it off. Other examples include interrupting night terrors, where a dog will jump on a bed, for instance, and do something called tactile stimulation and like lick or nuzzle or put pressure on a person when they're experiencing, one of these occurrences. There's deep pressure therapy where someone may be having like the starting of a panic attack or going in that direction, and the dog intuitively either picks up like physical gestures that the person involuntarily does. I don't know, maybe that's not the right word. Unintentionally, I don't know. Involuntary. Anyway, they do it and the dog picks it up and the dog's like, ooh, you're not feeling great. I should, relax my chest on your chest and provide that physical weight to help, you feel better. Because that is, some people find a lot of relief and assistance in that pressure on the chest or legs or wherever position they prefer. Some other tasks are like one of my clients, he has diabetes, and the dog will alert him when he's getting too close to having, some trouble. So there was a circumstance where this dog actually alerted a different person suffered with diabetes that their blood sugar was getting super low, because the dog just can pick up the scent and be like, I don't know, you're okay, my friend, but something's wrong with this guy. And the dog, it did the same prompt to convey to that person that something was off. And the dog's handler was like, do you happen to have diabetes? And the person's like, yeah. They're like, did you happen to just have a big meal with lots of like salty foods, etc.? And the guy was like, yes. And then the wife was like, oh my gosh, I knew it, your blood sugar's low. And it was very interesting because this dog is like superb at recognizing when people's blood sugar is low. So that's another thing, right? And this dog has also helped anticipate migraines and help the handler sit down and collect themselves before things escalate. So it gives the dog gives a heads up of like something's coming, and prepare for it by like doing a cue such as prolonged eye contact, like staring through the gentleman's soul, and then reacting with nudging or barking depending on if the person's not responsive. I mean, the list goes on. Anything you can dream up of that a dog could help a person, there's probably a dog out there doing it, making that person's life a lot more enjoyable than it was prior.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just smitten with the whole thing and the potential for learning, not just with my own dog. I have to say that I think I shared this story with you, Derek. I had been thinking about a service dog for a very long time, but because my disabilities are mostly invisible, I can be very covert about it. Doesn't need to be overt about it, and so I've been thinking very long and hard, but quietly, with myself and maybe my partner. I was getting closer, but there was still a lot of distance. We were at Safeway at the Northgate Mall, and we were sitting and having a coffee. So, no, I just skipped to the second part of the story. We were standing in line for a coffee, and in walked a gentleman with his wife and daughter and his service dog. And because I love dogs, I knew not to touch it, but I turned around and said, "You know, your dog is beautiful." And I introduced myself, and he talked a little bit about his dog, and that was that. And then I sat down with my coffee, and I couldn't stop paying attention to this man and his dog. So I really wanted to know where he had his dog trained, is essentially it. So I came back up over to him, and him and I began a private conversation where he felt safe enough to start revealing, as a young war vet with pretty severe PTSD, his life had really been interrupted quite fully, and he was mitigating divorce. He was going through a lot of really serious and traumatic things. And then I forget the dog's name, but the dog came into the picture. And as he said it, the dog essentially saved his life. As he was telling me the story, and it was very, he did not seem uptight. He did not seem to be getting worked up while he was telling me, although the content was very emotional. The dog gently came in between the two of us and came, oh, I'm going to cry again, and put his paws on his shoulders, like really gentle, up on his shoulders. And this gentleman knew, he just looked at me and he said, I'd love to keep talking, but he's indicated that it's not a good idea for me to continue talking about this. And I was just moved because the dog read the energy of this man from the inside, not from what was presenting at all, because I'm a voice specialist. I felt like I would probably know if he was worked up a little bit, and the composure was completely there on the outside, but the dog read it. That was it for me. That was when I was like, that's it. This is something I really need. It's not just a luxury, it's not a privilege, it's actually something that will really help mobilize health in me. And so that was my turning point. And I believe that's what's happened. I get asked quite often, what have you done in the last year and a half? What's changed? I've done a number of things, but the thing I think that's the most constant and the most influential is that I've acquired Lita.
Mhm.
And lots is starting to evolve.
Yeah,
Anyway,
absolutely. I mean, it's a very powerful story that you shared in the circumstance because it's a lot to take in, right? I mean, it's moving,
yeah, yeah.
and it brought an awareness that may have not come or can't come otherwise, right? I mean, you were aware of it obviously, but you're like, oh, this is a different level of awareness.
Yeah, I didn't understand service dogs is a little bit of the summary, right? I didn't really understand it fully. Um, and yeah, so that was my little story to add to the conversation that's occurring. Um, we talked about, you and I, we talked about a few things that could be brought forward, and maybe the importance of starting to talk about like how to acquire a service dog, whether you're looking at owner training or program dogs and things like that. Should we move on to a little bit of information about that?
Yeah, for sure. So there's some various options. Um, so the first one I'll bring up is like a program service dog, which really is just kind of a general term to describe a dog that a recipient receives from an organization. So, something like the Lions Foundation or Citadel Canine Society, where in a lot of these circumstances, the recipient is given the dog with minimal to no costs associated, and typically funded by a nonprofit organization and donations where the dog is trained to a very high standard and placed with these people. There are also program dogs that can be purchased, and that's more of a situation I do because I just don't have access to a lot of funds to do that in a different capacity. But I have been contracted before with those organizations like Citadel Canine Society to train post-traumatic stress assistance dogs on their behalf locally in southern Saskatchewan. So that's the first thing: is program service dogs, more or less someone acquires a dog from an organization. These are very wonderful organizations with very kind hearts that put a lot of love and heartache sometimes, because it's a difficult process in certain regards, and just genuine interest and care into raising and training these dogs and placing them. The other side of it is, because this is the kind of stalemate that happens, is there's just a lot more demand than there is supply. So, and there's a lot of people that could really use a dog that don't have the funds to purchase one. So there's this gap between people needing help that would really benefit from it and the actual number of dogs that there are to be placed. So the wait lists tend to be quite long with any nonprofit organization where the recipient acquires the dog for free. So that's just the reality of the situation, because the duration of time it takes to train a service animal can be 18 months to 2 years kind of thing, or even a bit longer, depending on the complexity of what's being taught and the disability that they're mitigating. So it's a long process, and not every dog makes it. So you know, sometimes when dogs wash out of that training, they have to be replaced, but it takes time to get that dog to replace it. So there's a lot of moving parts. So then owner trained service dogs are basically just as they sound. The person who has a family member or a disability is the one who's going to put in the time to train the dog for themselves. So the benefit of this is that someone can start to feel like they're making progress in the direction that they want because they're training their own service animal. The other positive aspect is that the dog will actually begin to help them sooner than later, potentially waiting 2 or 3 years to receive a program service dog. There's like ups and downs to both sides. It just is what it is. So with owner training, there's a lot more variables because the person who's the recipient is actually doing the training. So depending on their ability to consistently implement training and stay on task, and their understanding and ability to train, puts more variables into the pot, so to speak, which sometimes just can bring down the rate of success. Just because if it's not necessarily an easy task to train a service dog, and if you have limited dog handling and training experience, it's not necessarily going to be easy to do one of the hardest things off the bat, right? It's not like you're just training a puppy to not pee in the house. You have like a 1.5 to 3 years of training in front of you, step by step. And the more missteps or breaks or fumbles that happen, the longer the process takes to where it, ends up getting to. So with program service dogs, just to go back, because I'll talk about certifications a little bit, because there's a lot of confusion regarding it. But typically what happens when you get a program dog from an organization is it, comes certified to the recipient, and the recipient receives weeks to months of assistance and training to make sure that they maintain the dog and the dog is acting appropriately for them. Without getting in too much detail, basically there's a few organizations that are accrediting service dog training entities to certify these dogs. And like there's a couple, like for instance, one is Assistance Dogs International, and another is the International Federation of Guide Dogs, or I might have done it backwards. Anyways, it's something like that. Definitely no ADI, but The point is that, like for example, the British Columbia and Alberta both recognize rather ADI accredited training organizations and businesses as them being okay to certify their own dogs. Okay. Whereas, for instance, if you did an owner training circumstance, you're like, well, who certifies this dog? And the reality is in BC and Alberta, it's actually the government contracts trainers to test and certify them. Well, not certify them, they test them and then they send the information back to the government, and then the government goes through the processes to certify the team if they passed all the materials and so forth. So this is where it gets a little bit complicated, right? So owner training can be done and you can get the dog certified. But in Saskatchewan, it's a little bit different, okay? Because we don't have legislation written down that says we accept ADI accredited training organizations that they can certify their own dogs, or we have a provincial standard of this is what you need to pass to have yourself a certified owner trained dog. Okay. So that's where most of the time, like it's just, if you're unsure where to go with certifying a dog in Saskatchewan, it's like contact Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and take the step from there. What we've been doing with the Canadian Association of Service Dog Trainers, which is basically we're working towards having the same type of acceptance from a government and policy standpoint as Assistance Dogs International, but a Canadian version of it. Okay, so it's the Canadian Association of Service Dog Trainers. And we have like a very specific certification process from one side of the country to the other where it's the same thing and there's that congruency. And it's just going through the processes of getting different provinces on board to be like, what you do, we like it, good to go. Kind of similarly like British Columbia and Alberta did with ADI accredited dog training businesses that certify. Now, it might have created more confusion than not, but I'll let you answer that question, Tracy, if that makes sense or not.
Well, I'm not the best person to ask just because of the way I track and process, but I do get what you're saying. I believe you're right now. There's a movement towards understanding a particular criteria that would actually be put in place like the other provinces, so that I don't know if it means somebody would actually do the testing to see if a dog was certified, or if you as this person with this credential would just be able to say they're certified. I'm not sure.
Yeah, so basically what's I've been in touch with um, Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission and telling them, like, sent them the certification that we have and that we're going to start certifying dogs. Are you on board with this? Are you okay with it? And they, to generalize, it was more or less like the criteria for here, because it does say the dog should be certified in the policy, is that it's certified by a how did she word it? Reputable trainer.
Right.
So, but it doesn't say how, what that encompasses, and so on. So it's up for interpretation. So what we're trying to do is, because the standard is very similar to the standard certification test of Alberta government and BC government, it's really similar criteria. Is just bring some of that congruency and consistency throughout our organization, throughout the provinces, because you can have like Saskatchewan and Manitoba who have similar kind of broad open policies, and then BC and Alberta are having very clear understanding of this is what it looks like and this is how you get to point A from point B. So the premise is that things are just a little bit more open here as far as interpretation, and hence the reason why it's worthwhile to reach out to Saskatchewan Human Rights Commission when in doubt.
And that structure would, I would imagine, support you and help support you to support others. Is that possibly correct?
Yeah, well, absolutely, because it's just putting Um, the structure helps support everyone because it ensures there's a certain level of reliability and behavior from the dogs from a public um, safety
Hmm.
standpoint, that these dogs are, confident, they're reliable, they're not intrusive, and they are just a welcome member, and they don't actually really impact situations in public's places that they go into, other than people noticing like, oh, what a gorgeous dog. But they're not unruly, and they're not taking away from anything. They're really only adding for their recipient, in that format. So yes, the standardized kind of processes or certification just allows a parameter of what people could work towards, so that everyone stays safe and we don't unintentionally have public health risks, about.
That's, yeah, it's interesting. I find it fascinating. A while ago, a few months ago, I was shopping at Superstore and there was a woman with her service dog in training. He had a vest on, and I wouldn't have understood any of this had I not been working with you or talking sometimes with Maria Doyle, who's here today. She's a dog trainer, and also an LTD member. The woman was training herself. She said she was training from YouTube, and that's the way she was training her dog, and that it was legitimate that she could do that in Saskatchewan because of the way things were structured. I'm not sure if that's accurate or not as of today, but that's what she relayed. The thing I did notice is something that you brought up, which is her dog was very well behaved. He was very attentive to her. He did not stop looking at her though. Like that's the only thing he did in the entire time I witnessed them, because I was watching. I was watching them long before I spoke to them. And then as we spoke, he was like not 24/7, but you understand, he was constantly looking at her and just really intensely waiting for the food reward. And I understood how, I'm not sure where they were in the process, but there was quite a lot of rigidity in the actual animal himself. And I just wondered about your opinion around, like, you know, are we okay to be training off of YouTube when we're training for service? Or how much better of an idea is it to find someone like yourself or your team who understand things that, like, we won't. I'm being trained by you. I understand that totally. I don't mean that in any kind of weird way. I
Mhm.
understand I need more training in some ways than Lita does. My husband Ed, now that he's taken over some of the training, he understands the exact same thing. It's really clear. I just don't know that we could understand that through YouTube intervention or reading a book only. What's your take on that?
Once again, it's like just kind of looking at it from a place of statistics.
Hmm.
Like, I'm sure there could be some people that could have success with that if all the stars align, but statistically speaking, it's probably not going to fare well, just because there's no one with trained eyes to see 2 to 3 to 4 steps ahead where it's going to be going. Because there's been, a handful of times I've had to do assessments on people who wanted to get their dog, some intervention and assistance, but they were later stages of training with their service dog in training. And I gave them my honest opinion. I was like, I'm sorry that you've been working with this dog for 2 years, but there's no way that I would suggest you continue. I'm not saying you can't or cannot, because it's not my position, but I'm just saying that I could not help you continue to proceed with this dog because of, for instance, two of the cases where the dog was um, like fearful.
Oh.
I cannot have a dog that is scared of me just alone, not even including, being around a whole bunch of people in a public access situation where the dog is exhibiting fearful responses at me, where it's away from me, but barking and kind of like looking like, what are you going to do? What are you doing, guy? Or low growling at me and staring at me and staying with the people like this. Like, so that's sometimes where people get caught up, is they're really invested in the animal meeting their needs, and they just can't notice or recognize that it's not the right animal to, help them, because it can help them in certain regards. So that's where it's challenging. So, like I said, I'm not going to discourage anyone from doing it all on their own. And I'm not going to say that they need my assistance, but I have met many people that have had a very positive impact by getting assistance from someone who's been through it before. It's kind of like, well, an easy example is like I get a lot of business training and I hire a coach, but for maybe 10 years, I didn't. And I've made more progress in the last, year since I've been working with a coach, than I had in 10, because I have someone who's been on the road before, has traversed the path, and can anticipate the roadblocks that are coming and keep me on task to do the right things at the right time. So it's invaluable, right? And the return on investment is really high for me. Just to put it on like tangible terms, like what I pay my coaches return 3 to 5x consistently each month. So I'm like, this makes sense. It's a little more difficult to see the return on investment conceptually with a service animal. But once you realize, you're like, okay, I have someone supporting me. I'm staying on task more. I have a support system. We're working on things where we got hung up on for weeks to months that we're progressing through. And I feel like I'm moving forward. So that's, I guess, probably the simplest way to kind of mention it. Is just another thing too that really impresses on me, because this came up in just my regular portion of my dog training business, is that it is very common for people to misdiagnose what their dog is actually dealing with, suffering with, or why they're reacting a certain way. So we're under the interpretation when we're watching YouTube videos that we're assessing our dog correctly. My dog is doing A, and this YouTube video says do B to work them through it. But we forget that, well, what if we don't know what we're seeing and we're misinterpreting what's actually happening? I'm going to send them down a completely different path that isn't necessarily going to be beneficial. And I shared a story where I did this myself in my early days of flirting with becoming a dog trainer. Was I remember watching like a popular show at the time about dog training, and there was this dog that was really intense around vacuums, and it's like going and biting the vacuum when the person's vacuuming back and forth. And I'm like, oh, that's just like my dog. Because at the time I had Ozzy, the dog I was mentioning to you before, and this is maybe 14, 15 years ago. And I'm like, that's just like my dog. My dog needs to learn to not have issues with the vacuum. So then I started chasing my dog with the vacuum around, being like, no, you can't do this. Don't be scared of the vacuum. Being ignorant to the reality that my dog was more flighty, where the dog in the video was more fighty, and we had to deal with them in way different ways. But I was just ignorant. I just didn't know. You don't know what you don't know, right? Mm-hmm. So the lens that I was looking through was like, I was certain this was my dog. And now I'm like, God, there's no way it was even close, right? So that's the kind of awareness that presumably many people who haven't had experience or much or a lot in dog training will make very simple mistakes on assessing, which then will send you down a completely different path than perhaps you should be on, just from watching videos and consuming content alone. It's really imperative, in my opinion, for owner trained to have someone to bounce off stuff from, preferably a trainer who's been through and kind of walked the walk. And even a friend would be better than just by yourself, because people are going to see things differently than you can see yourself.
Mm. Mm. That's interesting. That's so interesting. Thank you. I guess I'm not sure where we are at for time. I could just keep talking.
2:47.
Yeah, it's pretty good. We're doing well. Um, I just wonder if there's anything else. Like we talked about examples of how you work with these different kinds of teams that you work with, but that I think has already been sort of integrated with what you were talking about. I wonder, is there anything, Derek, that you feel you would like to bring forward in the conversation that we haven't so far before we open up for discussion?
Um, just something kind of came to mind as far as like a story about my own personal experiences with dogs and service animals and kind of how this all spawned, if that's okay.
Absolutely.
I had actually been reached out from a client of mine, just regular, like we were doing problem behavior sessions with his dog, his other dog at the time. And the gentleman was trying to acquire a service dog from Citadel Canine Society, and he knew me from being local. And Citadel Canine Society ended up contacting me and vetting me and bringing me on as a team member. You know, this was over 7 years ago to train post-traumatic stress assistance dogs with them. So, anyways, needless to say, that's how I got started in this, just in general. But I really felt more called to do this kind of work and driven and interested and pulled after I had an incident, a near death incident, basically of my own that I suffered with in 2015. Um, so basically, to summarize, I used to work for the railway, okay, and I was a conductor, but worked in yard operations, which meant we serviced local customers. And one time I was riding on the end platform of a tank car, pitch black, and I've got my light, you know, little handheld light, and we're going over 3 crossings on the number 1 highway, and we're backing over. Okay, so my locomotive's way on the other side, like 20 cars away, and their headlights are facing the opposite direction, right? And we're backing up over the 3 number 1 highway crossings. And I'm shining my light at the semi trucks going by, trying to make sure that they recognize that we're coming. But we're going like 10, 15 miles an hour, not going super fast. So a few of the semi drivers slowed down when I shone them in the lights, and then I took my light off them. And then they're like, I can make it. So they sped up. And one of the drivers who sped up was actually blocking the peripheral view of a driver beside him. So the driver beside him took the cue of, oh, we can see the crossing signs are activated, but this guy beside me is going, so I probably got lots of time. And we're going closer and closer, and I'm like, hey, this guy's going to stop. So it's okay, keep coming. Like I'm giving instructions to the engineer who's driving. But then the guy changes his mind and starts to go again. So, anyways, things happen really quickly. But to summarize, what happened was the one semi got past us, and we collided with the second semi, and we were on the end platform of a tank car that ran into the semi trailer, and I was on the side step, basically right on the front, yelling at my trainee who had 3 children to get off, because I could see we weren't going to be able to stop in time, and I didn't want him to get crushed. And I'm screaming at him like, get off, get off. And I couldn't get on, like, and he wasn't doing it. He was just like deer in the headlights looking at me. And I'm like, ah. So I jump off like 20 feet before impact, and we collide with this semi trailer, and I run into the ditch. And thankfully I looked across and I saw his green vest running into the ditch too. And I was like, oh my gosh. So we hit right between the semi trailer and the back of the semi rig. So luckily the gentleman who was driving did not get really injured anyways, because he could have gotten killed too. But that one hit me hard because I had had a few other instances working at the railway where I had near misses, where I almost sideswiped myself twice, where I would get like crushed. And one time I fell off of moving equipment, it was dragging me. So this was, it was like this was the 4th incident, and I couldn't wash that one down and just suppress it because there was an actual big event and a crash and a boom. And then we had to stay there for like 2 hours while the highways were shut down, and I'm like stressed straight out. And needless to say, and my dad was a like a superintendent or of track maintenance, and he got called out and he was at the scene, and there was a lot of emotions. Like it really hit me hard, and I was off for over a month just mentally dealing with the impacts of that situation, because it was traumatic, because it was stacked too, because I had other instances, but I just like stuffed those feelings down and I pretended like I'm fine, it's okay. And then when this one, the lid came off and I couldn't deal with the emotions and feelings and thoughts, and I couldn't suppress them anymore. And I legitimately had some post-traumatic stress like symptoms, as far as, you know, like hypervigilance. I still deal with that. But and just feeling like really uncomfortable driving in my own vehicle, like when a semi would go by, I'd be like, and anyways, needless to say, and then the issues with going past the area. The reason I mentioned this story is just for context, because after I had gone through that and leaned on some dogs in my care, I felt like I kind of, not fully, but I felt like I had some kind of an inclination um, to feel like what people might be suffering to some extent with post-traumatic stress. And I just felt really drawn to try to help people in a way that I was fortunate enough to receive that other people weren't, by being surrounded by dogs. And they, like, there's been numerous circumstances where they would kind of do a task for me that I never trained them for, kind of just like emotional support style, um, and which really helped me. And I just realized like how impactful and amazing it was to have that resource of them, because I felt like it helped me work through some of those troubles faster than I would have without them. And I've leaned on dogs my whole life for that, but that's another side story. So because of that circumstance and events leading up after that, there's some opportunities came to me. I started to more delve into this portion of my business, where I was more intently trying to assist people with training, primarily post-traumatic stress assistance dogs, for themselves, or myself providing them to them.
Hmm.
So that was just something I wanted to mention, because it was really impactful and a transitioning moment mentally for me, for numerous ways, but with this portion of kind of the direction of a portion of the business going.
Yeah, thank you